Russia and Belarus share a language, religion, history, and even military alliances. So why haven't they merged into a single country? Think about it. They were once part of the Soviet Union. They use similar flags, and their presidents talk like old friends. In many ways, Belarus looks like a smaller version of Russia. But despite their deep ties and constant talks of union, Belarus is still a separate nation, and it's not just symbolism or technicalities keeping them apart. The real reasons lie in power, pride, and survival. In this series, we explore the histories and politics of countries that share borders. Why do they exist the way they do? What keeps countries together or tears them apart? And how do geography and geopolitics shape our world? Today, let's find out why two very similar neighbors stay frustratingly distinct. Act 1. The Hook. From Kiev to Moscow, both Russia and Belarus trace their roots back to the medieval Kievan Rus. Their common origins helped lay the foundation for centuries of shared Orthodox Christianity, the Cyrillic script, and Slavic culture. But around the year 1000, Belarusian lands became part of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, which later joined with Poland to form the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. For centuries, this grand union stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, uniting diverse peoples under one crown. But it also created a distinct cultural and political identity in what we now call Belarus. During this time, Moscow was a small and insignificant principality far away from the political and cultural center of East Slavic civilization. In fact, it was until the mid-17th century that Moscow overthrew the Polish occupation of Kiev and began asserting dominance over the region. Now, while Russia eventually grew to dominate the East Slavic world, Belarus's geographic location between Poland and Lithuania ensured it remained separate from Moscow's sphere of influence. That is, until World War I, with the collapse of the Russian Empire and the chaos that followed. Much of modern-day Belarus fell under the control of Germany and its allies. However, by 1919, both Russia and Belarus found themselves fighting against common enemies, whether out of necessity or ideological affinity. Both proclaimed sovereignty over the same territory, but ultimately it was the Bolsheviks who prevailed in what became known as the Russian Civil War. By 1922, the Soviet Republic of Belarus was established within the confines of the newly formed Soviet Union. Now, from the Soviet era through today, Belarus has been deeply integrated with Moscow. But here's where things get complicated. Despite extensive cultural, economic, and political ties, Belarus never ceased to exist as its own Soviet republic. It was deeply enmeshed with Moscow and the rest of the USSR, but if the Soviets were so hell-bent on crushing national identities and carving up regions amongst themselves, then why did they maintain Belarus as a separate state within the Union? First of all, it's important to recognize that the Soviet Union wasn't just some monolithic entity. It was made up of multiple republics, each with a degree of autonomy and representation in the central government. Secondly, while industrialization and Russification were definitely key aspects of Soviet policy, Belarus retained its own language, culture, and educational institutions. And finally, perhaps the most crucial point, Belarus and Russia simply didn't share the same borders in the way we think of national borders today. When the USSR was at its height, the idea of national borders within the Union itself was largely symbolic. The Soviet emphasis was on a broader pan-Slavic identity that transcended localized differences. When the USSR did collapse in 1991, Belarus became independent, but this new reality was short-lived. Soon enough, Belarus dropped the ISTs from its name, aligned itself with Moscow, and essentially maintained the status quo antebellum. As Russia descended into chaos and economic turmoil during the 1990s, Belarus provided a stable and familiar face for Russians looking for normalcy. And as long as Russian capital flowed into Belarus, Lukashenko was happy to play along. In fact, many viewed Belarus as a sort of Russian safe space, a buffer between Russia and NATO, a place where Russian culture and values could thrive without outside influence. The trouble is that Belarus isn't actually part of Russia, and as such it comes with certain obligations. The Belarusian people aren't obligated to vote for Russian leaders, participate in Russian foreign policy, or accept Russian military bases on their soil. It's a fine line for Lukashenko to tread, especially as the war in Ukraine rages on, and that brings us to today. Russia and Belarus are so intertwined that it's easy to view them as one and the same. But beneath the surface, there are some important differences. First, the relationship is built on a fundamental asymmetry of power. Russia is significantly larger and wealthier than Belarus, and as such, it has the upper hand in any negotiations. Secondly, both nations have invested heavily in maintaining the fiction of separation. From the Kremlin to Minsk, everyone benefits from the idea of a strong and independent Belarus. Finally, while there are certainly many similarities between the two nations, there is also a growing sense of Belarusian nationalism. Again, this is largely a reaction to centuries of domination by more powerful neighbors. But before we get into how these factors play out today, if you're enjoying this episode, please subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue exploring the untold stories behind modern borders. Act 3. The modern context. In many ways, Belarus is like the ultimate writer/fan favorite. It does everything Russia wants it to do, from echoing its foreign policy stances to providing military support, yet it never quite becomes an extension of Moscow. Why is that? Well, for starters, it all boils down to power. Since gaining independence in 1991, Belarus has enjoyed a unique position between Russia and the West. President Lukashenko has expertly balanced between Moscow and Brussels, tying each side against the other to maintain control. Merging with Russia would jeopardize this delicate balance, potentially leading to instability or worse, full annexation by Moscow. Secondly, there's the question of national identity. While many Belarusians identify as Russian, there is also a growing sense of Belarusian nationalism. This is partly a reaction to centuries of domination by more powerful neighbors, and partly a response to the perceived threat posed by Russian culture. Thirdly, Belarus serves as an important buffer zone between Russia and the rest of Europe. If Belarus were to merge with Russia, it could provoke international backlash, especially after the invasion of Ukraine. Finally, merging would bring about significant economic challenges. For example, Belarus has traditionally relied on Russia for energy and trade, while Russia sees Belarus as a market for its goods and services. But as two separate entities, they can negotiate these terms to their mutual benefit. As part of the same country, those negotiations would cease to exist in Belarus, but essentially become a consumer of Russian goods and services without any say in the matter. Plus, while Belarus has a relatively low standard of living, it also has a high level of inequality. Merging with Russia could exacerbate these issues, especially in rural areas. So no, Russia and Belarus may be close allies, but they're not about to merge anytime soon. Then what's driving them apart? Well, back in 1999, Russia and Belarus signed an agreement to create what they called a union state. The plan was to create a shared currency, a joint military, and a unified government. But progress has been slow, and much of the agreement remains symbolic. Belarus, as we mentioned earlier, maintains a certain amount of sovereignty. It has its own flag, capital, anthem, and even president. And while its economy is deeply tied to Russia's, it also maintains close ties with the European Union and other countries. Not to mention that, while Russian is the official language, Belarusian is taught in schools and used in government. And of course, we can't forget about the war in Ukraine. If Belarus were to merge with Russia, it could spark global backlash, something Lukashenko desperately wants to avoid. Remember, Belarus serves as a buffer between Russia and the West, and if push came to shove, he might prefer to lose his power and prestige as president than to see his country become a second Crimea. Act 4. Conclusion. So despite sharing language, faith, culture, and decades of tight alignment, Belarus stays separate from Russia because of historical legacies, political power games, emerging national pride, and the risks of total dependence on Russia. It's a delicate balance. Sometimes being almost identical makes unification more complicated than less, especially when control and identity are at stake. What about you? You think Russia and Belarus will ever merge? Let us know in the comments below. And if you found this breakdown interesting, hit subscribe for more untold stories behind modern borders. Thanks for watching. See you next time.